Here's a paradox that should keep you up at night. The United States, the nation that lectures the world about sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the rules-based international order, has tried to buy the same piece of land 3 times in 80 years. And each time they're told no, they come back with more pressure, not less. Most explanations focus on Trump's personality or Arctic resources. But that misses the system entirely. This isn't about one president's real estate obsession. This is about a strategic calculation that has survived 8 administrations, 2 global order shifts, and the entire Cold War. To understand why America won't stop, we need to go back to a moment when the ice held secrets that were never supposed to surface. In April 1946, a Danish diplomat named Henrik Kaufmann sat across from American Secretary of State James Burns in a room that smelled of old cigars and fresh anxiety. The war had just ended. Denmark was still counting its dead, and the most powerful nation on earth had just offered to buy Greenland for $100 million in gold. Picture those gold bars for a moment, stacked in neat rows gleaming under Washington's fluorescent lights. $100 million. That's roughly $1.5 billion in today's money, offered to a country so devastated it was still rationing bread. Kaufmann knew what his government would say. He said it anyway. No, not, let us consider, not, perhaps we can negotiate. Just no. Denmark's pride, it turned out, was not denominated in gold. Greenland had been Danish territory for over 200 years. They weren't going to sell their heritage like a second-hand automobile, no matter how many zeros America added to the check. Here's what most people get wrong about this moment. They think America shrugged and moved on. They think no meant something. But in the 80 years since Henrik Kaufmann politely refused that offer, America has never stopped trying to acquire Greenland. Not once. Not under Truman, not under Eisenhower, not under any president since. The methods changed. The obsession didn't. Why would the most powerful country on earth spend 8 decades pursuing a frozen island with fewer people than a mid-sized American suburb? The answer isn't resources, it isn't ego, it's geometry. Jens Mikkelsen was 23 years old when he first saw the Americans arrive in Thule. A young Inuit hunter from a village that had existed for centuries, he watched C-47 transport planes descend onto ice that his grandfather had crossed by dog sled. The year was 1951. The Americans brought machines. Jens had never imagined bulldozers that could move mountains of snow generators that hummed through the polar night radar dishes that spun slowly like mechanical eyes searching the horizon. What Jens didn't know, what nobody in Greenland knew, was what those radar dishes were looking for. Soviet bombers. The shortest flight path from Moscow to New York doesn't cross the Atlantic. It crosses the Arctic. It crosses directly over Greenland. And in 1951, American military planners were terrified that Russian nuclear bombs would rain down on American cities before anyone could sound an alarm. Greenland wasn't valuable despite being frozen at the top of the world. It was valuable because it was frozen at the top of the world. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Buying Greenland had failed. Building a base required Danish permission. So America decided to try something else entirely. Something Denmark would never approve if they knew about it. In 1959, a young Army engineer named William Colgan received orders that would define his career. He was to help construct Camp Century, officially a research station for studying Arctic conditions. The cover story was perfect. American scientists would drill ice cores, measure temperatures, advance human knowledge of climate. Denmark approved the project without hesitation. William Colgan knew better. He knew because he helped dig the tunnels. Imagine standing inside a glacier 200 feet below the surface. The ice around you is blue-white, compressed over thousands of years. It groans and shifts alive in ways that rock never is. Now imagine carving a city into that ice. Living quarters, a hospital, a chapel, a barbershop, a portable nuclear reactor providing power where no power grid could ever reach. Camp Century was extraordinary. It was also a lie. The real purpose was Project Iceworm, a plan to hide 600 nuclear missiles beneath the Greenland ice sheet. The concept sounds like science fiction. Engineers would dig thousands of miles of tunnels beneath the ice connected by railways. Nuclear missiles would move constantly through this frozen labyrinth, impossible for Soviet satellites to track. If war came, America could launch a devastating first strike from directly beneath the Arctic. Denmark's Arctic. Let that sink in for a moment. America had asked to buy Greenland. Denmark said no, so America secretly planned to turn Danish territory into the world's largest nuclear weapons platform without telling Denmark. Marta Jensen was a secretary in Copenhagen's foreign ministry in 1968 when the first rumors reached her desk. Strange reports about American activities in Greenland. Unusual shipments. Whispered conversations between officials who stopped talking when she entered the room. She was 34 years old, efficient, trusted with classified documents. But this secret was kept even from people like her. Denmark didn't learn the full truth about Project Iceworm until 1995, when American documents were declassified. By then, Marta was retired. By then, Camp Century had been abandoned for nearly 30 years. Its tunnels collapsed, its nuclear waste, and thousands of gallons of toxic chemicals still buried beneath the ice. By then, there was nothing Denmark could do about any of it. Here's the second question nobody wants to answer honestly. If America was willing to secretly install nuclear missiles in Greenland in 1959, what are they willing to do now, when Greenland matters more than it ever has? Because everything has changed since William Colgan dug those tunnels. The ice is melting. And beneath that melting ice lies something that makes nuclear missiles look like yesterday's concern. The Kvanefjeld deposit in southern Greenland contains one of the largest concentrations of rare earth minerals outside China. These aren't ordinary rocks. They're the elements that make modern civilization possible. The stuff inside every smartphone, every electric vehicle battery, every wind turbine, every advanced weapon system. China currently controls 60% of rare earth mining and 90% of processing. That's not market dominance. That's a chokehold on the future. Greenland could break that chokehold if it belonged to the right country. Niels Thomsen is 57 years old, a geologist who has spent 3 decades mapping Greenland's mineral deposits. He still remembers the day a Chinese mining delegation visited his survey site in 2012. They arrived in helicopters, wearing suits that cost more than his annual equipment budget. They asked questions in precise English, took photographs of everything, and left without saying goodbye. That night, Niels couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what he'd shown them, about what they now knew was buried beneath his homeland, about who would ultimately control it. Greenland isn't ice. It's a frozen Saudi Arabia of strategic minerals, and the geological wealth that Niels has mapped will determine which superpower dominates the 21st century. The United States offered $100 million for Greenland in 1946. Today, conservative estimates value Greenland's mineral resources alone at over $1 trillion. That's before calculating the strategic worth of controlling Arctic shipping routes as polar ice disappears, before adding the military value of territory that sits directly beneath Russian missile paths to America. Denmark still says no. They said no in 1946. They said no in 2019, when the question came back so publicly that a presidential state visit was cancelled over Danish refusal. They're saying no now as the pressure builds again with language about necessity and vital interests. But here's what keeps defense analysts awake at night. Here's the pattern that nobody in polite diplomatic circles wants to acknowledge. America has never accepted no as a final answer. Not in Hawaii, not in Panama, not in Puerto Rico. Every time America wanted territory badly enough, they found a way to take it. Legal justifications were constructed afterward. The ice is melting faster every year. The minerals are surfacing. The strategic value is compounding. And somewhere in Washington, planners are looking at Greenland the same way their predecessors looked at it in 1946 as a problem that money or patience or pressure will eventually solve. What happens when patience runs out? To understand why America keeps coming back for Greenland, you need to understand how great powers actually think about territory, not the way normal people think about real estate location, price, amenities. The way empires think about it. In terms of choke point supply chains and what military strategists call strategic depth. Think of it like a chess game, but the board is the entire planet, and the pieces are shipping routes, military bases, and mineral deposits. In this game, geography isn't just important. Geography is everything. And Greenland's geography is about to become the most valuable on Earth. Here's the mechanism that drives everything that follows. The shortest distance between 2 points on a globe isn't a straight line on a flat map. It's a curve called a Great Circle Route. And the Great Circle Route from Moscow to New York, the path a nuclear missile would take, goes directly over Greenland. This isn't politics, it's geometry. The same geometry that made Greenland valuable in 1946 makes it even more valuable today because the threat hasn't disappeared. It has multiplied. Erik Rasmussen spent 40 years as a radar operator at Thule Air Base, watching that geometry play out on glowing screens. He started in 1972, a young Danish technician hired to maintain equipment that tracked Soviet aircraft. Every shift he stared at the same empty Arctic sky, waiting for blips that he hoped would never come. Most nights nothing happened, Erik told Danish journalists after his retirement in 2012. But you never forgot what you were watching for. You never forgot that if something appeared on that screen, you might have 15 minutes to warn everyone you loved. Erik's job was to buy America 15 minutes. 15 minutes of warning before Russian missiles reached American cities. That's what Greenland is worth to the Pentagon. Not the land itself, but the time it provides. The early warning. The first look at anything coming over the pole. But here's what most people get wrong about Thule. They think it's a relic. A Cold War leftover that America maintains out of habit. The opposite is true. Thule has never been more important than it is right now. Remember those radar dishes that Jens Mikkelsen watched spinning in 1951? They've been upgraded continuously for 7 decades. Today, Thule hosts the northernmost deep space radar in the United States Space Force network. It tracks not just missiles, but satellites, debris, anything that moves in polar orbit. As space becomes a military domain, Greenland's position beneath the orbital paths gives it strategic value that didn't even exist when America first tried to buy it. Now imagine you're a Pentagon planner looking at a map of the Arctic. You see Thule, critical to everything you do. You see that it operates on Danish soil under agreements that require Danish consent. You see that Denmark is a small country that depends on American protection, but occasionally has opinions of its own. And you ask yourself a question that sounds paranoid until you realize it's standard strategic thinking. What happens if Denmark says no to something important? This isn't hypothetical. In 1968, a B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed near Thule. The conventional explosives detonated, scattering plutonium across the ice. Denmark was furious. They demanded answers about nuclear weapons flights over their territory, flights America had never told them about. For months, the relationship teetered. Lars Petersen was a young journalist in Copenhagen during that crisis. He remembers the rage in the Danish parliament, the editorials demanding that America leave Greenland, the genuine fear that Denmark's alliance with Washington had been built on lies. "We thought we knew what the Americans were doing in our territory," Lars wrote in his memoirs decades later. "We were wrong. We had always been wrong." Denmark didn't expel America from Thule. They couldn't afford to. The Cold War was at its height. Soviet tanks were parked across Eastern Europe. Denmark needed American protection more than it needed dignity. So they swallowed their anger, signed new agreements with better notification requirements, and pretended the betrayal hadn't happened. This is the mechanism of dependency. When a small country relies on a large country for security, the small country loses leverage over everything else. Denmark could be furious about nuclear accidents, secret missile plans, and lies about weapons flights. They could protest, demand, threaten. But they couldn't actually force America to change because the alternative facing the Soviet Union alone was unthinkable. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. And for about 20 years, everyone assumed Greenland would fade back into irrelevance. They were spectacularly wrong. Here's where the story pivots from military geometry to something even more consequential: climate change. The Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the global average. Sea ice that has been permanent for thousands of years is disappearing. The Arctic Ocean, frozen and impassable for all of recorded human history, is opening up. This changes everything about Greenland's value. Picture the globe from above the North Pole. See how Asia, Europe, and North America all cluster around the Arctic Ocean. Now picture shipping routes. Currently, a cargo ship traveling from Shanghai to Rotterdam sails south through the South China Sea, through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal, across the Mediterranean, around Spain, and up to the Netherlands. That journey takes about 35 days. The Northern Sea route along Russia's Arctic coast cuts that to about 20 days. The Northwest Passage through Canada could be even shorter. As ice melts, these routes become navigable for more months each year. By 2040, they may be open year-round. Whoever controls the Arctic controls the future of global shipping. And Greenland sits at the Atlantic gateway to the entire Arctic Ocean. But shipping routes are just the beginning. What's under the ice matters even more. Sigrid Olsen is a 43-year-old mining engineer who has spent the last decade surveying Greenland's southern deposits. She works for a European consortium that has been trying to develop the Kvanefjeld rare earth mine since 2007. 17 years of environmental studies, community consultations, and regulatory applications. In 2021, Greenland's parliament banned uranium mining, effectively killing the project. Sigrid watched years of work evaporate with a single vote. "The minerals are still there," she said in an interview last year. "They haven't gone anywhere. Someone will extract them eventually. The only question is who and under what flag." That question haunts every strategic planner in Washington, Beijing, and Brussels. Rare earth elements aren't optional. They're in every smartphone screen, every electric vehicle, motor, every wind turbine generator, every precision-guided missile. Modern technology doesn't work without them. And right now, China controls the supply chain. 60% of mining, 90% of processing. If Beijing decided tomorrow to cut off rare earth exports to America, entire industries would collapse within months. This isn't theoretical leverage, it's been used. During a 2010 diplomatic dispute with Japan, China quietly halted rare earth shipments. Prices spiked. Japanese manufacturers panicked. The message was clear: cross us, and we can strangle your economy. Greenland could break China's monopoly. The Kvanefjeld deposit alone contains enough rare earths to supply Western industry for decades. There's also uranium, zinc, copper, rubies, and potentially massive offshore oil reserves. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates the Arctic holds 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its undiscovered natural gas. For 80 years, these resources were locked under ice. Now they're surfacing. And suddenly, the frozen island that Denmark refused to sell for $100 million is worth more than most countries' entire economies. Here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in polite diplomatic circles wants to discuss openly. Denmark cannot defend Greenland. Their entire military, Army, Navy, Air Force combined numbers about 15,000 personnel. They couldn't stop a serious American action if America decided to take one. Their only real protection is the assumption that America wouldn't do something so brazen to a NATO ally. But assumptions are not guarantees, and America has been brazen before. Remember Niels Thomsen, the geologist who couldn't sleep after showing Chinese surveyors his mineral maps. He thinks about Denmark's vulnerability constantly now, about what happens when the ice melts enough that extraction becomes easy, about who will actually control the ground beneath his feet when the strategic value exceeds what polite agreements can contain. We tell ourselves that international law protects us, Niels said recently. We tell ourselves that America respects its allies. But I've read history. I know what happens to small countries with resources that great powers want. The mechanism is almost complete. A territory of enormous strategic value. A small country that cannot defend it. A great power that has wanted it for 80 years and has a history of taking what it wants. A changing climate that increases the stakes every year. All that's missing is the trigger. Something that shifts the calculation from not worth the cost to too valuable to leave alone. That trigger is already pulling. Let me show you the difference between what you've been told and what's actually happening. The public story goes like this. Trump made some offhand comments about buying Greenland. Denmark called it absurd. Everyone laughed. End of story. A real estate developer with delusions of empire embarrassing himself on the world stage. That narrative is comfortable. It's also dangerously wrong. What happened in 2019 wasn't a joke. It was a signal. And the people who understand how American power actually operates recognized it immediately. Aja Chemnitz Larsen was sitting in her office in Nuuk, Greenland's capital when the news broke. She's a member of the Danish parliament representing Greenland, one of the few indigenous voices in Copenhagen's corridors of power. Her phone started ringing and didn't stop for 3 days. Everyone wanted to know if this was real, she recalls. Journalists, diplomats worried constituents. I kept telling them the same thing. This isn't about Trump. This is about what comes after Trump. The fact that an American president said it out loud means they've been thinking it quietly for a very long time. She was right, and the evidence was already there for anyone willing to look. 6 months before Trump's public comments, the State Department had quietly reopened a consulate in Nuuk, the first American diplomatic presence in Greenland since 1953. The official explanation was increased Arctic engagement. The real purpose was establishing infrastructure for whatever came next. 2 months before Trump's comments, the Pentagon released a report on Arctic strategy that mentioned Greenland 17 times. 17. More than any other non-American territory. The report discussed access to strategic minerals and ensuring freedom of navigation in language that diplomats recognize as preparation for assertion. 1 month before Trump's comments, American mining companies began approaching Greenlandic officials about rare earth extraction rights. The conversations were preliminary, exploratory, but they were happening at a frequency that suggested coordination. Here's what most people get wrong about American territorial expansion. They think it happens suddenly. A president makes a decision, troops move, flags change. That's not how it works. American expansion happens slowly through accumulated presence, economic dependency, and manufactured crises. By the time the public notices, the outcome is already determined. The pattern has a name among historians, the slow annexation. And it's happening right now in Greenland. Malik Kleist is a 61-year-old fisherman in Ilulissat, a town on Greenland's west coast, famous for the massive icebergs that calve from the nearby glacier. His family has fished these waters for 5 generations. Last summer, he watched an American Coast Guard cutter anchor in his harbor for the first time in his life. The ship stayed for 3 weeks. The sailors were friendly, buying drinks at local bars, playing soccer with children on the rocky beach. When they left, they promised to return. My grandfather told me about the Americans who came during the war, Malik says. He said they were friendly too. He said they helped build roads and brought medicine. He also said that once they came, they never really left. Malik's grandfather watched Thule Air Base transform from a temporary wartime installation into a permanent American presence. Malik suspects he's watching the same process begin again 70 years later in a different part of his homeland. The American presence in Greenland is expanding on multiple fronts simultaneously. Military. Beyond Thule. America is funding new radar installations, satellite tracking stations, and scientific research facilities across the island. Each facility requires American personnel, American equipment, American security. The footprint grows year by year. Economic. American companies are investing in Greenlandic infrastructure, airports, ports, telecommunications. These investments come with conditions and create dependencies. When America builds your airport, America has opinions about who uses it. Diplomatic. The consulate in Nuuk has grown from a skeleton staff to a full diplomatic mission. American officials now participate in meetings they were never invited to before. Their suggestions carry weight they didn't carry a decade ago. This is how you take territory without firing a shot. You make yourself indispensable. You create facts on the ground. You wait until resistance becomes unthinkable. But there's another mechanism at work here, and it's even more insidious. America isn't just building presence in Greenland. It's building a case that Greenland needs to leave Denmark. Pause for a moment and think about what this means. Denmark isn't losing Greenland to American invasion. Denmark is being positioned to lose Greenland to Greenlandic independence. Independence that America will immediately step in to support, with security guarantees, investment, and all the trappings of alliance that make small countries dependent on large ones. The playbook is old. The execution is new. Arnangwak Olsen is 28 years old, a law student at the University of Copenhagen, who plans to return to Greenland and work for independence. She's part of a generation that has grown up hearing that self-determination is their birthright. What she's only recently begun to understand is who's been funding that message. There are think tanks in Washington that have been promoting Greenlandic independence for years, she told me. They frame it as anti-colonialism, as indigenous rights. And those things are real. We do deserve independence. But I've started asking why American institutions care so much about Greenlandic freedom when they don't seem to care about freedom anywhere else that doesn't have strategic minerals. She's asking the right question, and the answer is brutal. American support for Greenlandic independence isn't about Greenlandic freedom. It's about removing Denmark from the equation. A sovereign Greenland can sign whatever agreements it wants with whoever offers the best deal. And America will always offer the best deal, because America needs what Greenland has more than anyone else. Remember Niels Thomsen, the geologist who showed Chinese surveyors his mineral maps and couldn't sleep afterward? He's been tracking foreign interest in Greenland's resources for 30 years. What he's seen lately terrifies him. The Chinese were obvious about what they wanted, he says. They came, they looked, they made offers. The Americans are different. They don't just want the minerals. They want to make sure nobody else gets them. That's a much more aggressive posture. The rare earth situation is now critical. China's dominance over strategic minerals isn't just an economic advantage, it's a weapon. During trade disputes, Beijing has openly threatened to cut off rare earth exports to America. If that happened within months, the United States would be unable to manufacture smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, and most importantly, advanced weapon systems. The F-35 fighter jet requires over 900 pounds of rare earth materials. Every Tomahawk missile, every satellite, every piece of military equipment that maintains American dominance depends on minerals that China currently controls. The Pentagon has classified this as an existential vulnerability. Greenland is the solution. Not a solution, the solution. Here's where the rage should hit. The Inuit people of Greenland. 56,000 souls whose ancestors have lived on this land for over 4,000 years are being discussed in Washington, Beijing, and Brussels like they don't exist. Their homeland is being divided on maps in rooms they will never enter. Their future is being negotiated by people who couldn't find Nuuk on a globe. When Trump called Greenland a real estate deal, he wasn't being unusually crude. He was being unusually honest. That's exactly how great powers see it. Land, resources, strategic position. The people who happen to live there are at best an inconvenience to be managed. At worst, they're invisible. Nadja Rosing is a 73-year-old elder in Qaanaaq, the northernmost town in Greenland just 50 miles from Thule Air Base. She was 12 years old when the Americans came in 1953 and forced her entire community to relocate so the base could be expanded. They gave her family 4 days to pack everything they owned. 4 days to leave the homes where generations had lived, the hunting grounds their ancestors had used for centuries. They told us it was temporary, Nadja says. They told us we could come back when the danger passed. I'm 73 years old. I'm still waiting. The community was never allowed to return. The land where Nadja was born is still American military property. When she wants to visit her parents' graves, she needs permission from the base commander. This is what American strategic interest looks like when it lands on your doorstep. This is what it means to be a small people in the path of a great power's ambition. And this is what awaits all of Greenland if the current trajectory continues. But here's the twist nobody is talking about. Denmark knows it's losing Greenland. They've known for years. The independence movement isn't a surprise, it's been building for decades. What's changed is Denmark's calculation about what happens next. Lars Gert Luse is a former Danish ambassador who spent years working on Arctic policy. He understands the strategic realities better than almost anyone in Copenhagen. Denmark's position has always been that Greenlandic independence should happen on Greenlandic terms, he explains. Self-determination referendum, a peaceful transition. What terrifies us now is that it might happen on American terms instead, that the United States might simply take the process over. The fear isn't that Greenland will become independent. The fear is that Greenland will become independent on a Monday and a permanent American military alliance on Tuesday, with economic agreements that make American companies the primary beneficiaries of Greenland's mineral wealth locked in by Wednesday. Independence as acquisition, freedom as absorption, self-determination as a transaction where someone else sets the price. Denmark is trying to prevent this by accelerating its own version of independence, one that maintains Greenland's connection to Europe, balances American and Chinese interests, and preserves some role for Danish institutions. But they're running out of time. Because America isn't waiting for Denmark to get comfortable. America is already moving. Last year, the Department of Defense requested funding for Greenland infrastructure improvements in its Arctic strategy budget. The request was classified, but defense analysts who track these things estimate it at over $200 million. That's twice what America offered to buy the entire island in 1946, now being spent annually just on maintaining presence. The military buildup is accelerating. The economic integration is deepening. The diplomatic pressure is intensifying. And all of it is happening under a fiction that polite people maintain in public that this is about partnership, about shared interests, about the rules-based international order that America claims to lead. Erik Rasmussen, the radar operator who spent 40 years at Thule, watching for Soviet missiles, is 81 years old now. He follows the news about Greenland's future with the attention of someone who gave his career to that cold, remote place. We always knew the Americans were using us, he says. We accepted it because the alternative was worse. The Soviets were real. The threat was real. But now I watch what's happening, and I think who protects us from our protectors? The question hangs in the Arctic air like frozen breath. It has no comfortable answer. What happens when the country that guarantees your security is also the country that wants your land? What happens when your ally and your threat become the same thing? What happens when you're too small to resist and too valuable to ignore? Greenland is about to find out. And what happens there will tell us everything about what the American century becomes next. History doesn't announce when it's about to change direction. It just shifts quietly while everyone is looking elsewhere. By the time you notice, the new reality has already hardened into permanence. Greenland's fate won't be decided in a single dramatic moment. There will be no invasion footage on CNN, no tanks rolling across the tundra, no speeches declaring annexation. Instead, it will happen the way all modern absorptions happen, through 1,000 small decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, each one irreversible once made. The death of sovereignty doesn't come with a bang. It comes with paperwork. Let me show you what the next decade looks like. Not speculation. Trajectory. The path already being walked, extended to its logical conclusion. Aputsiak Jensen is 34 years old, a commercial pilot who flies supply routes between Greenland's isolated towns. His job exists because Greenland's infrastructure is minimal: few roads, no railways, communities connected only by air and sea. For 20 years he's watched promises of development come and go. By 2030, those promises will finally materialize. American and European investment will build 2 new deep-water ports, expand 3 airports, and construct the first paved highway connecting Nuuk to the southern mining regions. Aputsiak's routes will multiply. His income will nearly double. On paper, he'll be a winner. But here's what Aputsiak already suspects. The ports will be built to American specifications, capable of handling American military vessels. The airports will accommodate American transport aircraft. The highway will connect American-invested mines to American-controlled shipping. The infrastructure serves Greenland, but it serves American interests first. They're not building this for us, Aputsiak told me last year. They're building it for what they want to take out. We just happen to benefit while they're doing it. By 2034, Aputsiak estimates that 70% of his cargo flights will be contracted through American companies. His income will be higher than ever. His independence will be an illusion. Now contrast Aputsiak's trajectory with someone positioned on the other side of this equation. Michael Torres is a 41-year-old mining executive based in Denver, Colorado. He works for a company that has been quietly acquiring mineral exploration rights across Greenland since 2018. When we spoke, he had just returned from his 7th trip to Nuuk in 2 years. Greenland is the last major untapped mineral province accessible to Western companies. Michael explains with the enthusiasm of someone describing a gold rush. The regulatory environment is improving. The political situation is stabilizing in our favor. We're looking at rare earth deposits that could generate $50 billion over the next 30 years. $50 billion. Picture that number. Now picture who receives it. Michael's company projects that by 2035, they'll employ approximately 400 Greenlanders, directly good jobs, well paid by local standards. They'll also employ 12,000 workers globally in processing, logistics, and manufacturing jobs that will exist in America, Europe, and Asia. The wealth extraction ratio is roughly 30-to-1. For every dollar that stays in Greenland, $30 flow out. This is the mechanism of modern resource colonialism. You don't need to own the land. You just need to own the supply chain. What most people get wrong about Greenland's future is assuming it will resemble the past. They imagine either dramatic resistance or dramatic capitulation. Neither is likely. What's coming is more subtle and more permanent: the slow replacement of Danish and Greenlandic institutions with American ones, not through force, but through necessity. Consider what happens to Greenland's government revenue over the next decade. Currently, Denmark provides Greenland with an annual subsidy of approximately $540 million, about half of Greenland's public budget. This money funds schools, hospitals, social services. Without it, the government collapses. Denmark has used this dependency to maintain influence, but the arrangement is becoming untenable for both sides. Here's the twist: nobody is discussing publicly. American strategists have calculated exactly how much it would cost to replace Danish subsidies entirely. The number is surprisingly small. Roughly $800 million annually would make Greenland financially independent of Denmark, while creating profound dependency on America instead. For context, the United States spends $800 million on military operations every 14 hours. Buying Greenland for $100 million in 1946 was rejected as insulting. Buying Greenland's loyalty for $800 million annually by 2030 is just good strategy. The price of sovereignty, it turns out, has an inflation rate. Pipaluk Osterman is 52 years old, a teacher in Sisimiut, Greenland's second-largest town. She has watched 3 generations of students pass through her classroom. What she's noticed lately disturbs her deeply. 10 years ago, my students wanted to study in Copenhagen, she says. They saw themselves as part of Denmark, part of Europe. Now they talk about American universities, American scholarships, American opportunities. The gravitational pull has shifted. By 2035, Pipaluk projects that most of her advanced students will seek higher education in North America rather than Europe. This isn't inherently bad. American universities are excellent. But it represents something larger, an entire generation being oriented toward a different center of gravity. Danish influence fading not through conflict but through irrelevance. You don't lose a country by having it taken, Pipaluk observes. You lose it by having it look elsewhere for its future. The contrast with similar situations elsewhere is instructive. Puerto Rico became American territory in 1898. 127 years later, it remains in limbo, not a state, not independent, not quite colonial, but definitely not free. Puerto Ricans are American citizens who cannot vote for president. They receive federal benefits but have no voting representation in Congress. Their economy is structured around American needs. Their debt, held by American creditors. Their future decided in Washington by people they cannot elect. Is this Greenland's future? A permanent gray zone between sovereignty and absorption. Juan Carlos Mendez is a 63-year-old economist in San Juan who has spent his career studying Puerto Rico's structural dependency. When he looks at Greenland, he sees his homeland's trajectory repeating. The promise is always development, Juan Carlos explains, investment infrastructure jobs. And those things come, they really do. But they come attached to strings that tighten over decades. By the time you realize you've lost control of your economy, your politics, your future, it's too late to renegotiate. The architecture of dependency is already built. Puerto Rico's debt crisis, which has devastated the island since 2015, wasn't an accident. It was the logical outcome of an economic structure designed to extract value rather than create it. American pharmaceutical companies operated in Puerto Rico for decades, enjoying tax advantages, employing local workers, appearing to develop the economy. When those tax advantages ended, the companies left. What remained was debt. Greenland's mineral wealth could create the same pattern at larger scale. American companies extract rare earths, employing local workers, appearing to develop the economy. When the deposits run low or cheaper sources emerge elsewhere, the companies leave. What remains is an economy structured around extraction that no longer has anything to extract. But there's another possibility, and it's even more unsettling. What if Greenland doesn't become Puerto Rico? What if it becomes something that has never existed before, a fully integrated component of American strategic infrastructure, too valuable to neglect, but too small to matter politically? Imagine Greenland in 2045. 20 years from now. Picture the island as American planners currently envision it. 3 major military installations monitoring all Arctic traffic. 2 deep-water ports capable of handling aircraft carriers. 5 rare earth processing facilities, supplying American technology manufacturers. A population of perhaps 80,000, heavily dependent on American employment and investment. A nominally independent government, whose foreign policy aligns perfectly with Washington because the alternative economic collapse is unthinkable. This isn't occupation. It's optimization. The conversion of a territory into a strategic asset without the inconvenience of formal acquisition. Remember Nadja Rosing, the 73-year-old elder who was relocated as a child to make room for Thule Air Base. She has grandchildren now. They've never known a Greenland without American presence. By 2045, her great-grandchildren will grow up in a world where American influence is simply the natural order, as invisible and unquestionable as the ice that once covered everything. The Americans are patient, Nadja says. They think in generations. We think in elections and budget cycles in 4-year terms. They think in centuries. That's why they'll win. Here's the question that haunts every honest analyst looking at Greenland's trajectory. Is there an alternative? Can Greenland chart a course that preserves genuine independence while benefiting from great power investment? Or is the binary American dependency or Chinese dependency the only realistic option for a small nation sitting on resources that superpowers need? Denmark has tried to offer a third path: European integration, Arctic cooperation, multilateral frameworks that dilute any single power's influence. But Europe is weak in the Arctic. Europe has no military presence that matters, no economic leverage that competes with American or Chinese investment, no strategic interest that matches what Washington and Beijing are willing to spend. The European option is comfortable. It's also increasingly fictional. Erik Rasmussen, the retired radar operator who spent 40 years at Thule, thinks about these questions in the quiet hours of his retirement. He's watched Greenland's strategic value rise his entire adult life. He's seen what American presence means in practice, the jobs it creates, the services it provides, the autonomy it erases. My children ask me what Greenland will look like when they're my age, Erik says. I tell them I don't know, but I tell them to learn English, not Danish, English. The advice breaks his heart. It's also the most practical thing he can offer. By 2040, projections suggest that English will surpass Danish as the primary second language in Greenland schools. By 2050, Danish may be reduced to a ceremonial language spoken in official documents, forgotten in daily life. The linguistic shift mirrors the political shift. When you change how people speak, you change how they think. When you change how they think, you change who they are. This is the long consequence. Not the dramatic fall of a nation, but its quiet dissolution into something else. Something that keeps the flag and the anthem while losing everything that once made them meaningful. Greenland isn't being invaded, it's being absorbed. And the difference matters less than anyone wants to admit. What happens next depends on decisions being made right now in Nuuk, in Copenhagen, in Washington. Most of those decisions are being made by people who will never live with their consequences. The trajectory is set, the destination is visible, and the time to change course is running out faster than anyone with power is willing to acknowledge. The ice is melting. The resources are surfacing. The great powers are positioning. And the people who actually live in Greenland are watching their future being decided by everyone except themselves. Let's return to where we started. April 1946. Henrik Kaufmann sits across from James Burns, $100 million in gold on the table, and says no. 80 years later, his great-granddaughter Anna Kaufmann is a 31-year-old diplomat in Copenhagen's foreign ministry. She works on Arctic policy. The family irony is not lost on her. My great-grandfather thought he was protecting Greenland by refusing the American offer. Anna told me last winter, sitting in an office that overlooks the same harbor where Danish ships once departed for the North Atlantic. What he was actually doing was starting a negotiation that never ended. America heard no and thought not yet, not. Anna keeps a photograph of Henrik on her desk. Sometimes during long meetings about Greenland's future, she glances at it and wonders what he would think of the world his refusal created. A world where America didn't buy Greenland, but built bases inside it anyway. Where Denmark didn't sell sovereignty, but watched it erode through accumulated dependency. Where the offer was rejected, but the outcome remains uncertain 8 decades later. The pattern is now visible. Not conspiracy. Pattern. The distinction matters. In 1946, America tried to purchase Greenland outright. Denmark refused. America built Camp Century instead, secretly planning nuclear missiles under Danish territory. In 1968, a nuclear accident exposed the lies. Denmark protested, but couldn't change anything. Thule remained. American presence deepened. In 2019, the purchase idea resurfaced publicly. Denmark called it absurd. America reopened a consulate, increased military investment, and began building infrastructure. In 2024 and 2025, the pressure intensified. New language about necessity, about strategic imperatives, about options that go beyond polite diplomacy. Each iteration follows the same structure: request, refusal, adaptation, expansion. The goal never changes, only the methods. This is not a story about one president's real estate obsession. This is a story about how great powers pursue strategic objectives across generations, adjusting tactics while maintaining direction. Trump said out loud what 8 administrations thought quietly. The next administration will think it too, whether they say it or not. Remember Niels Thompson, the geologist who showed Chinese surveyors his mineral maps and couldn't sleep afterward? I called him last month to ask what had changed since we first spoke. "Everything and nothing," he said. "The ice keeps melting, the minerals keep surfacing, the interest keeps growing, but now there's something new. People have stopped pretending this is about partnership. Everyone knows it's about control. The only question is whose." Niels is 58 now. He figures he'll retire before the question is definitively answered. His children, though, they'll live with whatever answer emerges. They're learning Mandarin and English in school, just in case. The framework for understanding what comes next isn't complicated. You don't need insider information or classified briefings. You just need to ask 3 questions whenever you hear news about Greenland. First, who benefits from this specific decision and who bears the cost? Follow the money. Follow the strategic advantage and you'll find the real motivation behind the rhetoric. Second, what would this look like if a different great power did it? If China built military bases in a small country's territory without full transparency, what would American officials call it? Apply the same standard in reverse. Third, what is the trajectory? Not the moment individual events mean less than the direction they're moving. A single military exercise is nothing. A decade of expanding presence is everything. These questions won't give you certainty. Nothing gives you certainty in geopolitics. But they'll help you see the mechanism beneath the headlines, the structure beneath the noise. Here's the contrarian point that will make some viewers uncomfortable. America is not the villain of this story. There is no villain. There are only interests competing, colliding, sometimes aligning. America wants Greenland because Greenland matters strategically, and great powers pursue what matters to them. China would do the same. Russia would do the same. Any nation with the capability to influence Greenland's future will try to influence it. That's not evil. That's the operating system of international relations. The tragedy isn't that powerful countries pursue their interests. The tragedy is that small countries and indigenous peoples get caught between those interests, their futures determined by calculations that have nothing to do with their lives, their cultures, their hopes. Naja Rosing the Elder, who was relocated as a child to make room for Thula, is still alive. Still waiting for a return that will never come. Still watching her homeland discussed in rooms she'll never enter. I asked her what she wants people to understand about Greenland. She thought for a long time before answering. "We are not land," she finally said. "We are not resources. We are not strategic position. We are people. We have been here for 4,000 years. We will still be here when all these governments and corporations are forgotten. But what we will be, what kind of people, under what kind of rule, that is what's being decided right now, and we have almost no say in it." Picture a map of the Arctic viewed from directly above the North Pole. See how the continents cluster around that frozen ocean like hands reaching for something in the center. That something is now accessible. The ice is opening. The roots are clearing. The resources are surfacing. Greenland sits at the edge of that opening, the first major landmass encountered by anyone traveling from the Atlantic into the new Arctic. Whoever controls Greenland controls the gateway. And whoever controls the gateway shapes the century to come. America understood this in 1946 when Soviet bombers were the threat. America understands it now when Chinese supply chains and Russian submarines are the threat. America will understand it in 2046 when threats we cannot yet imagine will make Greenland valuable in ways we cannot yet conceive. The ice melts. The calculation stays frozen. What happens next is not predetermined. Denmark could find backbone it hasn't shown in decades. Greenland could chart an independence that genuinely preserves autonomy. International institutions could matter more than they currently do. These outcomes are unlikely, but they're not impossible. More probable is continuation. The slow absorption we've traced through this video, expanding presence, deepening dependency, eroding alternatives, will continue until something breaks. Either Denmark accepts the inevitable and negotiates the best exit it can manage, or Greenland declares independence and immediately discovers what independence means for small countries with large resources. Or America gets impatient and manufactures a crisis that justifies more direct intervention. The mechanism is in motion. The timeline is measured in years, not decades. The people who will live with the consequences are already being born. Aja Chemnitz-Larsen, the Greenlandic parliamentarian whose phone rang for 3 days when Trump first mentioned buying her homeland recently, gave a speech in Copenhagen. She talked about what it means to represent a place that great powers treat as a prize rather than a home. They see ice, she said. We see ancestors. They see minerals. We see children who deserve to grow up in a country that belongs to them. They see strategic position. We see the only home we have ever known. The speech received polite applause. Nothing changed. This video began with a paradox. The most powerful country on Earth lecturing the world about sovereignty has spent 80 years trying to acquire territory from an ally. That paradox is not a contradiction, it's a revelation. Rules exist for those too weak to break them. Power makes its own exceptions. Greenland is not about Greenland. Greenland is about what kind of world we're building as the ice melts and new territories become valuable. It's about whether small nations have futures or just placeholders. It's about whether indigenous peoples have rights or just rhetoric. It's about whether the rules-based order is real or just a story powerful countries tell while doing whatever they want. The answer to those questions is being written right now in Nuuk and Copenhagen and Washington, in corporate boardrooms and military planning sessions, in budget documents and classified briefings. Most of us will never see those rooms. But we'll all live in the world they create. Henrik Kaufmann said no in 1946. His great-granddaughter Anna is still saying no in 2025. Somewhere a Kaufmann not yet born will face the same question in 2050. The ice will be thinner then. The stakes will be higher, and America will still be waiting for an answer it likes. For 80 years, Greenland has been too cold to fight over. That excuse is melting faster than anyone wants to admit.